Overwatch is a game about controlling space through using resources in an efficient way to either force space from the enemy team or force them to use a disproportionate amount of resources to stay in that space, okay? The idea is an efficiency game. We press button, they press 2 buttons. We gain an advantage. We use that advantage to either deepen our angles and push into better space and control the map more, or to push for kills and breakpoints on the enemy team, or to push for cooldowns on the enemy team that essentially allow us to get kills later on. That's the game. Ultimate to this thing that just goes on top and acts as an extra resource that we can use in order to force space, attempt to force cooldowns, and get kills. So to start with DPS, every character has some sort of DPS. Specifically here, I'm talking about ranged DPS that essentially has to be played at a certain distance away from the enemy team. So DPS with range implies cover. Overwatch has infinite acceleration. AD strafing behind cover is really good. Everyone likes to AD strafe behind cover because essentially AD strafing behind cover allows you to lose fights without dying. If you can lose a fight without dying, you can be healed and get resources from your team in order to re-peak the angle and continue doing a fight over and over at an advantage. The fact that there is instant acceleration and that ranged DPS can abuse this in healing essentially means that Overwatch is a game where you have to go into melee range to get people off of cover or get sharper or burst your DPS into them so they're threatened to die if they peek around that cover. This is why like Widow and Hanzo control sightlines, Ashe with headshots and damage boosts and stuff like that control sightlines really effectively because essentially you can't peek because you can't guarantee that you'll be able to unpeek before being chipped down. So that's the start of DPS. Complementary angles is my second topic. When I say complementary angles, I mean if we stack 2 people on top of each other on the same angle, they necessarily put out less pressure than doing split angles. Necessarily put out less pressure. And the definition of pressure we're going to be using all the way along here is essentially pressure is the threatening of the enemy team in a way that threatens kills so that they must use cooldowns, abilities, resources, take space, give away space in order to survive. Pressure is a thing that essentially threatens them to the point where they have to do something to not die. That's essentially pressure. So when tanks eject pressure over the enemy team, what we're saying is the tanks are going to do a localized period of high pressure, and the enemy team's going to have to either press buttons in order to stop having to move out of that pressure, or they're going to have to leave that area. So splitting angles, complementary angles, are just better than stacking a sightline. That is the number one, because it removes enemy cover. It essentially makes it so you can peer into the enemy backline. It gives them no safe place to stand. It makes it so that they have to go from looking one way to the other way in order to actually like shoot you and force you off. In general, if we have one sightline, it's made about 1.5 times better by having a split sightline with about the same amount of pressure on it. So if we have, for instance, we just have this right sightline here, the presence of this left sightline improved this right sightline by 1.5 times. Okay, so instead of going from 1 to 2 by stacking them up, we increase the amount of total pressure we apply to the enemy team by about a factor of 3. So we have about a factor of 3 pressure by splitting the sightlines. The deeper these sightlines are, the better they are. In general, obviously, stuff like high ground we can talk about in a second. It does increase your sightlines, it increases your cover. It is a better type of deeper angle. You can just kind of think of it as that. So complementary angles, you want to split your damage. Very simple. 2 damage sources at their correct range is always better than 1 damage source in the middle, or 2 damage sources in the middle. Simple. The deeper the angle, the more vulnerable you are by being taken away from your team. Yes, the more vulnerable you are, the deeper your angle. There are angles you can survive at, but essentially what we're talking about is if these angles are up at the same time, and that's why the next topic is going to be timing, essentially you get more from having them up at the same time compared to having them both up in the middle. You will always get more uptime for your angle by stacking stuff in the middle. So for instance, if we think we're going to win by a pure resource war with the enemy team's tank, we would just stack 2 sightlines in the middle because we're going to have more total damage by stacking them in the middle and making sure they can be consistent and have like 100% uptime. But if we think we're not going to win for a resource war, we cannot do this. This is just completely false. You have to actually split angles. And the deeper these angles are, the better they are. Timing next. Time is a very simple thing. 3 different timings, early, middle, and late. Let's imagine that this is your team's pressure. 1, 2, 3. Early, middle, and late. So early timings are going to force the enemy team's attention onto you. It may force their cooldowns if your pressure is good enough. And because their cooldowns are forced, it's going to either allow your team to rotate and get to better positions without as much pressure on them, or allow them to do more into the enemy team when they apply their pressure. pressure. So when this happens, your team's pressure, if you have gone here early, you essentially make their pressure slightly better. If we want to make their pressure as good as possible, naturally what we do, if we just stack extra pressure onto it by putting our cooldown cycle at exactly the same time. Now there's this assumption here that the enemy team have a certain amount of resources they have before they essentially have to press their buttons in order to survive, and that's normally around here. But you have this extra thing where the enemy team in Overwatch 2 compared to Overwatch 1 have a lot more denial buttons. They have Suzu, they have Life Grip, they have Lamp, they have Slide, they have Bubbles. They have a load of denial abilities that essentially you cannot do anything into them by pressing deeper and further into them with this pressure. So essentially you can guarantee by putting your pressure at the same time as your team that you get their breakpoints and you force their cooldowns, but you cannot stack 6 ultimates on top of each other and guarantee kills unless the enemy team literally just fuck up in quite a few situations, especially at higher ranks. At low ranks, you just stack stuff, the enemy team gets to press their buttons and we kill them. Simple. At higher ranks, the enemy team has all these buttons, they have to use them first. The fights in Overwatch 2 have become layered. They have become ultimate cooldowns, ultimate kills. If you don't do ultimate cooldowns, ultimate kills, you essentially just have nothing. It doesn't do anything. So that's the mid timing. You can use it to guarantee that you force enemy cooldowns by peaking at exactly the same time, or you can try and time yourself early, or you can try and time yourself late. So late timing at the end is essentially capitalizing on what your team has done. It's capitalizing on the cooldowns they forced. It's capitalizing on the fact that this peaked higher and they had to use buttons or be displaced or do other things. And therefore you're going to do more, get more kills, not force cooldowns because they've already forced their cooldowns. And more importantly, with the late time and the middle timing, they have less attention to give to you to make you go away because they're dealing with your team. They're dealing with your team's pressure. And because we're in Overwatch and we're on competitive, the enemy team's going to each individually press their buttons. There's no coordination there. They're not going to cleanly rotate out from your pressure. Therefore, you're in a general rank sense, you're just going to get better by doing late timing. Late timing is very likely to allow for uncontested pressure. Yes. So that's the second point. That's essentially DPS so far. So we'll just delete this. So essentially, Overwatch is a game when you talk about DPS about range, angles, and timing. Okay, you want to be on the deepest angle you can at the correct range for your character at the right time in order to do the most amount of stuff. Now, this timing thing, it has some asterisks to it. It has asterisks to it because I will get onto in a bit. You can essentially force a position through resources. You can force pressure through resources. You can stay in an angle far beyond what you're meant to stay in an angle, continue to put out uncontested pressure. You can go early and you can stay in for the mid fight. You can go in at the mid fight and stay until late. Generally, because of the DPS passive, this has reduced over time because obviously you have less sustain and you have a bigger health pool, so you generally use things in a bigger burst. But in terms of resources, you can kind of augment this timing and think about the timing in a deeper sense when you think about support resources being given to you. Rat equals go Junkrat, yes. Okay, so that's DPS, very simply DPS. That's pretty much all of DPS. Everything else kind of like it goes from there. You don't really need to know that much more. The hero specific stuff is so much less impactful than the actual the actual big picture stuff. And we'll be covering more stuff for DPS in a little bit that does apply to them, but goes into like a general category instead of a DPS category. So tanks, okay? Very simply, you have two kind of like fundamental different types of tanks, and there's a spectrum between them, right? We have bursty tanks that get a lot from being given stuff and want to use stuff really like fast, and then we have a spectrum that runs down to the gradual tanks that want to stay in a place, get value from staying in the place, and grind down the enemy team's resources. Very simply, Sigma's up here and Reinhardt's over here. If you'll know, the gradual tanks don't actually care how much health they have, whereas the bursty tanks are inactive if they have no health. So this is a really important thing for supports, because you need to know whether your tank actually is capable of doing more by being given more stuff, or if they can't do any more regardless of how much you give them. For instance, there's a popular Overwatch soliloquy which goes, "Do not shove resources up Arissa's ass. She ain't gonna do anything anyway," because it doesn't matter. You can shove as many resources up Arissa's ass as you want. The only thing she's gonna actually get, apart from if she's using her ult cycle and other things like that, is she's gonna get to stand in the place she wants to a little bit more standy. She's not gonna actually do more pressure. And now pressure obviously is what you're talking about here. This guy does pressure in a big burst. This guy does pressure over time. So essentially what we're thinking about is both DPS and tanks, if we're support, are conduits for our pressure, okay? We use stuff, resources, we give it to either DPS or we give it to tanks, Ooh, typing is hard. And we try and create the most amount of pressure onto them as possible given our resources. As I stated at the start, like Overwatch is a game about controlling space through using resources to force space or force a disproportionate amount of resources from the enemy team in order to stay in that space. We have a certain amount of stuff to give out. Where does it go? That's the first question of support, the first like fundamental question. I can't hear the rhythm. I did not have a rhythm, that's true. So the question is, what do tanks want and what do DPS want? In general, a team wants throughput. Throughput, I call a certain amount of numbers that essentially make it so that you win the numbers fight against the enemy team. I count this as healing and damage. Essentially damage reduction onto your tank by taking away healing from them. Reduce the amount of damage they do, increase the amount of damage you do. Throughput in general is a numbers game. Okay, throughput is on a spectrum. If you're designing a game and you have a, let's say 80, if we just define it just as the healing per second right now, before we go a little bit more in depth and bring in the other things. Throughput, if you have an 80 healing per second and you have a 55 healing per second healing source, which one's better? I'll leave you to answer that. Which one's better, the 80 healing per second or the 55 healing per second source? I'll have a drink. I'll wait for you. We have one source with more healing, one source with less healing. Which one's better? And yes, it is a trick question. Oh god, my light's fallen to pieces. Can't answer that unless we know what the damage throughput is. Fair enough. We're just saying we have more healing or less healing. The answer is, when you're a game designer, you balance more healing and less healing. And obviously, you can balance these characters regardless through every other part of their kit. Of course you can. You can give the guy with less healing, you can give them more damage. But if we want the thing with more healing and less healing to be balanced with regard to each other, what we should be doing is changing other parameters about that healing. The parameters we're looking for are consistency and reliability. Is it reliable to be given to you? Is it something that can be given to you in a beam? Does it have reloads? Can people miss it? Is it hard to hit? Is it easy to hit? Does it require a lot of the healer's attention in order to do this onto a target? And this essentially defines a spectrum of sources. Okay, this essentially defines a spectrum. Throughput versus reliable. So we're defining throughput as like Anna's shots. Takes her a lot of attention to land them, requires a lot of skill to land them, so it won't be happening at low or mid levels very often if she has to be going 45-degree angle in order to heal two people. It has travel time if it's not scoped in. If it's scoped in, it cuts off sight lines. There's a reload attached to it. You have to wait for Anna's first shot to be used on the target in order for her to turn and use the second shot on you, because it's in bursts. It's not just this linear function. Is that you can actually just time it wrongly and Anna needs to heal you, but she can't for a quarter of a second because essentially like she's already used the click. There's a lot of moving parts here versus a reliable healing sources like Mercy's Beam. So Mercy's Beam requires no attention from her. You have a thing on your screen to tell you you have it so you know it's there. Mercy can have perfect attention in terms of when she swaps it from target to target. There's no travel time, there's no reload. It's reliable, consistent healing. So that's the spectrum. Essentially, the throughput or the higher healing sources have to be less certain, less easily applicable, should I say. Okay, so then we have another spectrum that's going on at the same time as throughput versus reliable, and this is in the same way. We have another spectrum which is bursty versus slow. So these are two things that you're defining against each other. Bursty resources can be more intense. Very simple. Suzu is a massive fucking burst of resources. Mercy Beam and Harmony Orb are completely different. You have things that heal over time and are slow in the effect they have, and you have things that are big, punchy things, cooldowns, that sort of stuff. So essentially, like we have this trifecta of like sources for healing. We have bursty healing in terms of bursty support, Suzu Life Grip Lamp, that sort of stuff, BAP Shift, Moira Orb, that sort of stuff, the stuff that's on cooldowns. Then we have the throughput sources, and we have the consistent throughput and consistent. So the throughput sources, these are the stuff that you use to keep your team up in general. These are better easily applied at mid ranks to tanks. These are less easily applied to angles and DPS. In general, people on angles with DPS want consistent resources to be given to them and want to get that healing instantly so they can repeat from that angle. We're talking about the DPS that's going behind a corner because they've got instant acceleration and repeaking over and over and over. They want consistent resources. They want Mercy Beam. Is Brig in the middle then? Some burst, some overtime, fairly reliable, but also requires resource management, so throughputty. Yes, so I'd say Brig's health packs were a lot more to do with consistency and the the reactivity of them beforehand. And now that the cooldown's been decreased, it's gone a little bit more towards throughput and burstiness. Since they just added on a flat amount of healing to people, they kind of did everything at once, I would say, yes. They were kind of like in the middle of the design space here. So essentially what we're talking about is DPS want the consistent resources, tanks want the throughput resources. Who wants the bursty resources? That's the third question. Who wants the bursty resources? These ones. So this is DPS. Tank. When I say tank, I mean the general team, generally keeping their team active. I don't mean specifically just the tank. Who wants the bursty resources? Ulti wants bursty? Yep. Anything else? Who wants bursty? Dive tank prefer burst? No? Like monkey? Yep. So who wants the bursty resources? And now, yeah, it's another trick question. Of course, it's another trick question. I choose the busty tank. I assume you didn't accidentally misplace your R there. Okay, so the people that want the bursty resources are, as Luxcross says, everyone wants the bursty resources, but they want it at a specific time, okay? Bursty resources are time-bound. The aggressive tanks want it when they're doing their aggressive bursty cycle. The aggressive tanks want it when they're being aggressively burst into. The DPS want it when they're being aggressively burst into. And quite a lot of what you're seeing here is it's not to do with, it's not specifically to do with anything else. It's more to do with range. If something's in melee range, if there is a likelihood of a kill, the bursty resource gets better. You want to be using your bursty resource on a Winston jumping a Cassidy in both ways, right? You want to be using it to defend the Cassidy, and you want to be using it to reinforce the Winston. You don't care about using your bursty resource on a Cassidy shooting at an angle because there's better places to use it. You don't DM a Cassidy on an angle for 3 seconds unless there is no other resource to use on it. It's not a good use of the thing. You'd rather wait until the melee range fight happens and they try and push the Cassidy on the angle. We'll get to whip shot. So essentially, these are the types of resources you have. Bursty as rescue, 100% bursty as rescue. Yeah, you use a shitload of bursty resources as rescue. And to be clear, the bursty resources don't have to be healing sources. They don't have to be healing sources at all. So in terms of how you design a resource, there's a really like big spectrum you can design it in, but these are kind of like what you're thinking about, okay? So when you're playing a support, what you're thinking about is, how do I use my resource optimally? Do I use it on the tank? Do I use it on the DPS? Do I use it on bursty things in general? Would I rather use it on bursty aggressive options? Would I use it rather on bursty defensive options? That's the spectrum you're thinking of. So that's all supporting resources really like defined closely here. So let's talk about the bursty defensive options. So as Andrew said, defensive bursty options have an extra thing. Some defensive bursty options, some bursty options in general, can only be used for defense. So whip shot moves the enemy team away. It's not a great aggressive option. Boop from Lucio, can that be used aggressively? That's a question for you. Can Lucio's boop be used aggressively? Can be? How? How do you use it aggressively? Whip can be used aggro. It can be used for a burst of damage aggro, yes. Whip combo, sure. Never use it to boot people out over cover as a debuff bomb. What I'm going for here is essentially you can boot people back into your team. You can, when the enemy Reinhardt is extended in a melee range, so you say melee range, the bursty stuff is generally around close range combat, you can go above them, you can boop them in, and you can murder them. Or in goats, you can boop them up and you can shatter under them. There were a load of different things with Lucio back in the day. Load of different things where you use the defensive burst options aggressively. And we'll get to why you do that later. Essentially, there's quite a lot of options that can be used defensively and you want to be used defensively. So boop, in general, are more easily used defensively. That's essentially what I'm getting at there. What other things do you want to use defensively, right? You got lamp, nade, bubble, DM, you've got life grip, you've got your body, you've got your damage cooldowns. All of these defend an angle really well, or you can use them aggressively. So essentially what we're doing is, do we want to control this space? When the enemy team does a pressure cycle into us, when they throw a Winston at us, do we want to stay here and use resources, these resources, the ones that could potentially be used aggressively, or do we want to essentially just give the space and then use them back aggressively? So there's a lot to be like covered there. There's a lot of depth there, and that's what you should be thinking about with your bursty resources. There's another thing we have to think about. Dueling potential, deflect, dash, all of the stuff that makes you better at close range fights. Magnade, like your general left click, your general right click, your health bar. These are all resources that you use in a defensive burst in order to stop the enemy team taking space from you. If you're casting on the high ground and a Winston jumps you, you aren't just using Magnade. You're using Magnade, your health bar, your dueling potential, your damage. All of these things are actual things that are used in a defensive burst. Cool. So there's one additional factor here that we haven't said. Mobility. Mobility is a thing that makes it so you can hold more aggressively, or you can extend more into a defensive burst option by trying to defend an area and get out safely. So the fact that Moira has Fade means that she can use more of her resources safely to defend against an aggressive burst and get out. She can use more of a health bar. It's more guaranteed that she survives if she uses more of a health bar. Despite the fact that she doesn't really have very many good tools to actually fight out Winston jumping on her, she can actually stay in there for quite a long time and be reliable in that duel. If, for instance, an enemy Cassidy gets on your Cassidy on high ground, your Moira is going to help with that more than an Ana is in some situations, because the Moira is implied to be able to actually help with that duel and be safe helping with that duel. So mobility and defensive option, that sort of stuff, especially mobility cooldowns, are actually used to defend and in particular defend angles. That's what I'm talking about with defensive burst. Would you call it mobility or escapability? Well, mobility, like Sojourn's slide, allows you to more safely take the aggressive positions and get out of them if they're deep. Escapability allows you to fight those aggressive positions more rooted. Do I need to go back in the VOD to understand this combo? I'm essentially giving all Overwatch knowledge to you. So yes, if you want to understand all of Overwatch, you probably need to scroll back a bit. So there we go. We talked through resources, we talked through DPS, we talked through tanks, we talk about what DPS want, we talk about what tanks want, we talk about what people doing stuff want. Let's talk about like first mover's advantage. So there's this concept in Overwatch where the person that does things first gets an advantage. So obviously we have this cooldown trade. There's buttons on every single character that you have to press in order to like actually be able to kill them. Moira has to Fade, Reaper has to Wraith. This is a lot more evident in Overwatch 2 than it was in Overwatch 1. How do we force those buttons? So we are gonna do a solution. A solution can be like a good angle that has like consistent pressure on them. A solution can be a bursty aggressive option. A solution can be a pressure cycle from a tank. A solution could be an ultimate. And these guys are gonna use their buttons. Because the enemy team in ladder are idiots, they're stupid, they're all gonna independently press their buttons separately. And when they independently press their buttons separately, do you know what's gonna happen? They're gonna use a completely, utterly disproportionate amount of stuff to survive. They're just gonna press everything. If you press an ultimate, in a general sense, especially in a ladder when you're not in pre-planned team fights in like proper competitive organized play, you're gonna press an ultimate and they're gonna press at least two to survive it. This is generally applicable and it really favors aggression. Okay, so there's a general sense on ladder that aggression is utterly favored, and it always will be. This actually, yeah, this even works in pro play. 100% even works in pro play. There is not perfect communication. Nobody communicates whether they're going to use Moira Fade to escape or whether beat's coming on. They'll use Moira Fade if they think they're going to die. So aggressive options are massively favored in all things. So essentially what we're talking about is, do we use our stuff defensively or do we use it aggressively? You always tend towards the aggressive options. You always tend to do as many aggressive things as possible. Force ultimates in aggressive ways that they don't normally fit, because that's how you're going to get a better advantage. So that's the first mover's advantage. It breaks down in high rank, but for the most part, it's applicable to every single rank there is. And this goes really deep into the next one, the next point, which is throughput and ultimate generation. There is a point in every fight when you're at about 80% ult charge where you should abandon everything else and get ult and use ult. That's all you have to do. 80% ult, get ult, use ult. It's very simple. You might even abandon staging for this. You might even abandon advantage for this. You might even give up a good angle for this. You might even use buttons non-optimally for this, because the ultimate is a good enough solution that is going to force a disproportionate amount of the enemy stuff regardless. So essentially this is throughput. This is farming. You will just do as much damage as possible, because using your ult into this fight is always going to be better or more impactful, or is always going to offer a better solution to force more of the enemy team's resources than anything else you're going to do is. Is this first fight or every fight? Every single fight where you're at 8% ult, you're going to be able to use it more aggressively than anyone else on your team if you're smart, and you always should farm for it. You will see 9 times out of 10, if somebody in GM or top 500 gets to 80% ult charge, they will abandon all other things to farm for ult and use ult. Very simple. Because as I said at the start, and I'm going to keep coming back to this, the game is about controlling space through using resources to either force the enemy team to leave the space or force a disproportionate amount of resources from them in order to keep the space. Okay, that's what the game's about. So this ultimate gives you a better solution than almost anything else, and you may as well farm and use it. That's why the first mover advantage favors ults, and that's why you favor the ult so much, because the first move's advantage is so big. Guys, I'm charging tree. No, but actually, Andra, you will abandon an angler's Lifeweaver and start right-clicking a Roadhog because it's going to give you a little bit more ult charge and you can tree earlier, because that is a better play than being in the correct position, healing your DPS, getting your DPS a better solution, keeping them in an angle, doing all of this other stuff, because you can rely on yourself being reliable and you can't rely on anyone else being reliable. Right-clicking the Roadhog feels good. Yes, the Rolf theorem in practice. You don't have to abandon the Angler's Lifeweaver, but you might if it's going to get you a little bit more ult charge. Okay, and to be clear, you don't want to abandon your angle. You don't want to give up anything, but you might if it allows you to use that solution faster. There's plenty of times in this game where you will abandon good places in order to get more numbers as a thing. And to be clear, like, the throughput, the numbers can be completely opposite to angular control and completely opposite to actually being able to get a kill. You will abandon being able to potentially get a kill in order to just go main and do a little bit more healing or damage. That's a normal thing to do, and that is a reasonable thing to do. That's something you should be actively doing no matter what character you're on, even when you think that may be cancelled by something. So my question to you, Silence, is if you think you have a Sigma ult and you know the enemy Lifeweaver is going to put a tree on top of it and cancel it, is it still better to farm the Sigma ult and use it and guarantee in almost any rank that the enemy team are going to use more than the tree in order to counter it, because they're going to press other buttons, they're going to press other ultimates, they're going to lose their positioning, they're not going to react like it's countered smoothly by the tree. That's a tightest example we can give, right? The tightest, easiest example we can give. Or you can say, you know what, should I farm a Lariol? Should I farm Capture's Son when they've got a Suzu on their team? And when they've got a Suzu on their team, it's basically nothing. All they're going to do is press this Suzu. Should I farm it even though it's going to be not used properly? It's going to be countered? Exactly. Well, yes, because it's not going to be countered proportionately, because the enemy team's going to press a shitload of other buttons at the same time. First mover advantage counters most of the bad trades you can have. Work on the assumption it's cancelled as its trade. Just work on the assumption that you're going to get a resource advantage for using something more aggressively. What about ults to secure winning fights versus saving to initiate next fights? The answer is you got your ult late into the fight. That's a more in-depth question. That's based on a weighting of whether you think you can win it with this ultimate. What I'm talking about is if we're in neutral and we're on 80%, or we just spawned and we're on 80%, we will play differently in order to make sure we have that ultimate for the actual initiation to force the original cooldowns. So there's a lot of depth there. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of depth in it's mid-fight and we haven't used our ult, or we forgot to use our ult. But the answer there is you should have used it earlier for the most part. That's the answer. There is some nuance here, but this is a general rule that applies up to top 500. I guarantee you, you do not have to think this hard about this. Everyone wants to think really hard. You also need to distinguish between team and rank play, 100%. You don't want to set too many ults at the same time, 100%. So when you're in rank play, you might disincentivize throughput because you know you don't need your ultimate to the start of a fight, because we're going to layer our ultimates one after the other in order to force their cooldowns, then use it. So we're not that desperate to have our ultimate early. There's more stuff you can think of there. Realistically, if anyone's in a team, you probably still don't think about this until you're in GM level. Ult track the enemy team goes a long way in the decision process. Nope, just farm your ult and use your ult. It's really that simple. There is not very many asterisks on this. There are asterisks, but there's not that many. If you use it first, then it's not your responsibility anyway. 100%. Yeah, agree. That is true. It's their problem. They're gonna stack a load. As Ogara says, in team play, we'll do it differently. And stuff like Zen and Lucio ult, in ladder, you'll try to go out of your way to actively use Zen and Lucio ult aggressively if there are options to use them aggressively. There are things that are more defensively geared and reactively geared. You should be trying to fit that square peg into a round hole every time you get a chance to. 100% you should be trying to. It might not work, but this is how you gain rank more consistently. Also, please don't aggressively use Diva ult, but I'm fine with them aggressively using Diva ult if there's enough engagement from their team that it guarantees the cooldowns they use to move away from Diva ult are capitalized on. And that's a question: can they smoothly disengage? So we'll go on to the next one, which is pretty much the totality of this, right? You have different parts of your kit as a support player, and we're going to go on to the Alari in a second. You have Throughput. How much healing per second do you have? How stable can you keep the team? Does the tank need more resources in order to do more pressure later on? Remember, it's all about creating more pressure on the enemy team. It's not about doing stuff yourself, necessarily. Do we want to prioritize healing the tank because the tank wants to do a pressure cycle? Do we want to ignore the tank because the tank doesn't care if they have more resources to do a pressure cycle? Do we want to, maybe, instead, do we want to use an angle? So that angular use. Do we want to go to an angle and shoot people from that angle instead of doing the Throughput? That's a decision you're making. You should be making that decision, and that should be based around your ult status partially. Should we, instead of doing the Throughput, be doing angular support? Should we be healing somebody on an angle in a good place instead of the tank? Does the tank put out more proportional pressure, force more of the enemy team's resources than you put into them compared to the amount of resources an angle can force on the enemy team? Does the angle for you count as a potential solution to the fight that the enemy team have to respond to, or does it not? It's a real big question. You're gonna have to actually question this yourself. And remember here, right? Angular use in general is a poking angle, and as we've already covered, you want to split poking angles as much as you possibly can. So if we have angular use and angular support, these things can be mutually exclusive. You can want to support an angle and have to choose to bring yourself closer to their angle so your angular use gets worse. That's a decision you should be making. It's a hard decision, but it's one of the big picture questions. This is most of the game, to be clear. Then we have our bursty resources. So we have bursty aggressive options and bursty defensive options. So let's do lowercase d because I've done lowercase for the rest of it. Bursty aggressive option, bursty defensive options. So bursty aggressive options, do we want to use something aggressively? Do we want to keep it defensively? Do we have defensive tools that help us keep an angle, like whip shot, like our health bar, like our shield on Brig? Do we have aggressive options like Discord Orb, which enables a pressure cycle from a tank to go deeper and further? Do we have a nade? And you'll note quite a lot of the aggressive options actually get better the better your aggressive angle is into the enemy team. So you will prioritize pulling a deeper angle for the aggressive option, and you'll prioritize pulling a deeper angle for the defensive options. So really, like, everything here but the Throughput gets better with angle. Every single thing gets better with angle. The deeper you are on an angle, the better you can use it, the better angle you can support, the better you can aggressively reinforce your burst with your burst options, and the better you can fight defensively for your good angles with your defensive burst options. This is Overwatch. This is pretty much the whole of Overwatch. That is the totality of my TED talk. And now we're going to talk about actually applying it. We're going to talk about actually applying it. Is this from support's POV? This is from every single character's POV. Just what you'll find is supports get to use angles, Throughput to make a big burst, reinforce a big burst, reinforce angles, and defend angles. They get to do everything. Supports do everything. So as a tank, all you have to do is think about the amount of Throughput we have in. Do we want point control? Can we make a better angle? Can we cut off damage on us in order to increase the amount of resources we have? Do we need that defensive angle? Should we fight for that defensive angle with our resources? Are we taking too much away from our supports in order to do this linear fight down main? Do we need to cut off some like, should we just be AFK right now? Do we need to do anything? Can Throughput be damaged as DPS? 100%. So when on Throughput, obviously I'm talking about the resource war between you and the enemy team. I'm not talking about anything else. I'm talking about whether the enemy team are more burned down than you in general. Do you have more stuff? Because them having less stuff is a catalyst of pressure in order to force their cooldowns. Obviously, when I'm talking about the angular use, I'm not talking about more kills. When I'm talking about the Throughput, I'm talking about spam and numbers. Yes. Any questions about this before we go into specific examples? Maybe I'll clear it all up in examples. I think we're good.